At dawn on November 20th, 1943, hundreds of American landing craft approached a narrow coral island in the central Pacific, Betio, part of the Tarawa Atoll. It was supposed to be simple. Naval bombardment had flattened the island, the Marines would ride their landing craft straight onto the beach, and the battle would be over in a few hours. But the planners had been wrong about one thing: the tide. Instead of 5 feet of water covering the reef, there were barely 3. The shallow water stopped most of the Higgins boats dead. Their propellers thrashing coral amphibious tractors made it across. But there weren't enough of them. That morning, more than 1,000 Marines found themselves trapped on the reef half a mile from shore, wading through waist-deep surf toward an island ringed with Japanese machine gun nests and coastal guns. Every step forward came under fire. The first waves were slaughtered before they reached the sand. Tarawa had just become the costliest 76 hours of the Marine Corps' history. In the weeks before the landing, Marines on transports in the Gilbert Islands rehearsed assault drills and listened to confident briefings. Commanders told them the island would fall in 3 hours. Intelligence estimated no more than a few hundred defenders, mostly labor troops. The reality was the opposite. Betio was a fortress. Only 2 miles long, it bristled with 4,500 Japanese defenders under Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, a career naval officer who had spent a year turning it into an interlocking grid of concrete pillboxes, artillery positions, and bunkers dug into the coral itself. He told his men, "1 million men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years." From his perspective, it wasn't a boast. The Japanese had built overlapping fields of fire, zeroed in every approach line, and placed 8-inch naval guns covering the lagoon. Meanwhile, U.S. intelligence relied on aerial photos and outdated British tide charts from the 1890s. They didn't know the exact reef depth, or that the invasion date coincided with a neap tide, when the moon's position reduces tidal range. To the Marines, Tarawa was supposed to be a fast victory, proof that America could take a defended island head-on. To Shibasaki and his men, it was a test of how long they could make the enemy bleed. When the first wave hit that reef, both sides learned the truth at once. Tarawa wasn't just another island, it was a test case for America's entire Pacific strategy. After Guadalcanal, U.S. planners in Washington and Pearl Harbor debated how to reach Japan's inner defensive ring. The Central Pacific Drive, led by Admiral Chester Nimitz, called for a leapfrog campaign across the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, building forward airfields on each captured atoll. Tarawa Atoll lay in the Gilberts, roughly halfway between Hawaii and the Marshalls. The main island, Betio, held the only Japanese airstrip in the group, a 4,000-foot runway capable of threatening every future step westward. By late 1943, the Japanese had turned Betio into a miniature fortress under Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki. For the Americans, taking it would open the door to the Marshalls and prove that amphibious assault tactics, developed, tested, and argued over for years, could work on a heavily defended island. For Nimitz and the newly expanded 5th Amphibious Corps, Tarawa would be the first real laboratory for coordinated land-sea-air assault. For the Marines, it would be the blood-price demonstration of what that doctrine actually meant. Tarawa mattered because everyone at the top, political and military, knew the eyes of the entire war effort were on this single strip of coral. If the assault failed, it would call the whole Pacific campaign plan into question. Betio, the target of Operation Galvanic, was barely 2 miles long and 800 yards wide at its broadest point, a flat sliver of coral sitting just above sea level. Its lagoon was ringed by a reef, 500 to 800 yards offshore, and beyond that reef, there was no natural cover. Rear Admiral Shibasaki had spent a year and thousands of Korean laborers turning Betio into the strongest fortification the Japanese had built in the Pacific. Up to that point, he ringed the beaches with seawalls of coconut logs packed with coral and sand, backed by pillboxes of reinforced concrete, with firing slits barely visible from the water. There were 4 8-inch naval guns salvaged from the cruiser Kirishima, 40mm and 13mm anti-aircraft guns, mortar pits, and interlocking machine gun positions controlling every landing approach. Every bunker was connected by trench systems and communication tunnels, so defenders could shift position without exposure. Shibasaki's troops, mostly from the 7th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force and 3rd Special Base Force, numbered around 4,500, including engineers and gunners. The island's single airstrip ran almost its full length. Behind it sat ammunition stores, radio stations, and the command post. When American reconnaissance planes photographed Betio in the fall of 1943, analysts could see that the place bristled like a sea urchin. U.S. officers recognized that they'd never faced a position like this before. What they didn't recognize was how much that shallow lagoon and its reef would amplify every advantage the defenders had built into it. Planning for the Tarawa assault began under Admiral Raymond Spruance's 5th Fleet and Major General Holland M. Smith's Amphibious Corps. The landing force would be the 2nd Marine Division under Major General Julian C. Smith, about 18,000 men carried by Task Force 53. American reconnaissance relied mainly on aerial photography and a handful of submarine periscope surveys. Hydrographic charts came from old British Admiralty surveys dating to 1897, accurate enough for navigation, useless for predicting modern amphibious conditions. The assault plan called for 3 regimental beaches on Betio's northern shore. Naval gunfire from battleships Maryland, Colorado, and Tennessee, plus cruisers and destroyers, would bombard for 3 hours before the first wave. The 1st Marine Regiment would hit the western beaches, the 2nd and 8th Marines the center and east. For transport, planners relied on the new LVT amphibious tractors, nicknamed Amtracs, to carry initial waves over the reef and onto the sand. Later waves, it was assumed, would follow in Higgins boats, which drew more water but could easily clear the reef at high tide. That assumption proved fatal. The invasion was scheduled for the morning of November 20th, based on tide tables predicting about 5 feet of water across the reef. In reality, the moon was near apogee, creating a neap tide that never rose past 3 feet. The miscalculation wasn't caught until after the battle. Years later, a physicist at the University of Washington reconstructed the moon's orbit and confirmed that the chosen date guaranteed abnormally low water. The reef that should have been submerged stayed exposed, and the landing craft that should have cruised over it stopped dead. At 5 o'clock, naval guns opened fire. Battleships and cruisers pounded Betio for nearly 3 hours. Observers on ships thought nothing could have survived. But when the bombardment lifted, Shibasaki's fortifications were mostly intact. Many bunkers were concrete-roofed and dug below ground. The defenders had simply waited out the shelling. At 9 o'clock, the first wave of LVTs from the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines began crossing the lagoon. The amphibious tractors crawled over the reef and reached the beach, but they were thin-skinned. Small arms fire ripped through their sides, and most were destroyed on their second run. Behind them came the Higgins boats, carrying hundreds of Marines from later waves. They hit the reef and stopped in 2 or 3 feet of water. Now, stranded half a mile offshore, Marines climbed out and began wading toward the beach under fire. Japanese machine guns and mortars opened from bunkers lining the seawall. Communications broke down, radios shorted out from seawater. Commanders offshore could barely tell who was alive or where the front line was. Some platoons lost 2/3 of their men before reaching the first line of sand. Those who made it found no real cover, just shattered coconut logs and shallow craters. Casualties were so high that units reformed spontaneously under whoever was still standing. By noon, the landing had degenerated into chaos. A handful of scattered beachheads, wrecked tractors burning on the reef, and the rest of the division pinned down in the surf. The misread tide had turned Tarawa into a killing ground, and the battle had barely begun. By mid-morning, the lagoon was a graveyard. Dozens of landing craft sat stranded on the coral. Marines tried to push them free and were cut down in the shallows. Those who bailed out began the longest few hundred yards of their lives, 500 to 1,000 yards of chest-deep wading under rifle, machine gun, and mortar fire. The only cover was the wreckage of their own vehicles. Staff Sergeant William Borden, a radio operator with the 2nd Battalion, recalled that men fell every few steps, and the living just kept walking. Command structures dissolved. Company officers were killed within minutes. Sergeants took over. A few amphibious tractors tried to ferry reinforcements, but the Japanese had zeroed their ranges perfectly. Every run cost another crew. Those who reached the seawall huddled behind it with no way to communicate with ships offshore, their radios ruined by saltwater. Isolated groups began using hand grenades and satchel charges to clear pillboxes one at a time. The reef had done what Shibasaki's fortifications alone could not. It had broken the attack into fragments and left the Marines to improvise survival. By afternoon, scattered footholds existed, but no continuous beachhead. General Julian Smith, commanding from his flagship, couldn't tell which battalions were still alive. He ordered more landing craft and destroyers forward for direct fire support. Naval gunfire from the cruiser Honolulu and destroyers Ringgold and Dashiell began shelling positions barely 50 yards ahead of the Marines. The coordination was so close that some shells exploded between friendly lines and Japanese bunkers. Late in the day, Major Michael P. Ryan of the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines organized about 70 men from various units and pushed inland, knocking out 3 key pillboxes and creating the first solid lodgment. Nearby, 1st Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman Jr., executive officer of a shore party detachment, led an assault against a major Japanese strongpoint near the pier. Armed with flamethrowers and demolitions, his team cleared a series of bunkers and breached the island's central defense line. Bonnyman was killed, leading the charge, and later awarded the Medal of Honor. That night, surviving Marines dug in among the wrecks and bodies on the beach. Reinforcements landed at dawn, and naval bombardment resumed at point-blank range. By November 21st, the Marines had broken through the airfield and split the island in two. Shibasaki's garrison fought to the last man. Of roughly 4,500 defenders, only 17 were captured alive. The battle ended after 76 hours of fighting. The Marines counted over 1,000 dead and 2,000 wounded in just 3 days. When combat photographers released the first uncensored footage, bodies in the surf, wrecked landing craft, wounded men dragged through shallows, it stunned the American public. The country saw for the first time what an amphibious assault really looked like. Congress demanded explanations. Navy and Marine inquiries followed, but none led to charges. The reports called the losses the result of a series of errors and unavoidable circumstances. The tide mistake, bad charts, and underestimation of Japanese strength all shared the blame. No one was court-martialed. Command responsibility was too diffuse, split between intelligence, hydrography, logistics, and senior command. But the lessons were written in blood. Every future landing would require accurate tide surveys, better reconnaissance, and an assumption that anything that could go wrong probably would. Tarawa forced the U.S. military to rethink how it fought island wars. Within weeks, new rules were issued. Soundings of reefs had to be made in person, landing craft redesigned, LVT production expanded, and naval bombardments lengthened. The 2nd Marine Division, what was left of it, helped shape the training for every Marine unit that followed. Many of those same men would later land at Saipan and Iwo Jima. On Betio, Seabees rebuilt the captured airstrip into a forward base named Hawkins Field. The island became an American outpost almost immediately, even as hundreds of dead Marines were still being buried in makeshift cemeteries. Some of those graves went missing for decades before recovery teams returned in the 2010s. Rear Admiral Shibasaki never surrendered. He was killed with his staff on the second day. His prediction that 1 million men couldn't take Tarawa in 100 years lasted 76 hours.